The starward venture was not a pretty ship. It was built from need, not pride. Thick armor plates covered its body like scars, and its engines made a sound that Ethan Cole had once described as a washing machine dying slowly. But it flew, it held together, and right now it was carrying 46 humans across a stretch of space that no human had ever crossed before. Ethan was not supposed to be part of anything important. He was the ship's engineer, the guy who crawled through tight spaces and fixed things that broke at the worst possible time. He had grease under his fingernails that had been there so long he had stopped trying to wash it out. He liked his work. It was honest. Pipes didn't lie to you. Wires didn't play politics. The politics were someone else's problem. Captain Nora Bell stood at the front of the briefing room with her hands behind her back and her jaw set like a locked door. She was a small woman, barely 5'4", but nobody on the ship had ever made the mistake of thinking that mattered. "Listen carefully," she said. "We are about to dock at Nytheris, the homeworld of the Aelori Dominion. This is humanity's first formal summit with an elder species. That means every word you say, every move you make, and every look on your face will be judged. These people have been traveling between stars for 10,000 years. They think we are children. Do not prove them right." Danny Shaw, the ship's pilot, leaned over to Ethan and whispered, "So no burping at dinner?" Ethan almost laughed, but caught himself when Nora's eyes swept across the room like a searchlight. Megan Price, the cultural liaison, took over and explained the basics. The Aelori were tall. Most of them stood over 7 feet. Their skin was silver white and covered with faint markings that shifted with their moods. They valued control, silence, and perfection above all things. Showing strong emotions in public was considered weak. Speaking too loudly was an insult. Touching someone without permission was practically a crime. "So basically," Danny muttered, "everything I do naturally is illegal there." Megan ignored him and continued. The royal family would greet them upon arrival. High Sovereign Drathos ruled the Dominion with absolute authority. His eldest son, Prince Kalen, was his likely heir. There were other children, but Megan only mentioned them briefly. One name passed quickly: Princess Valeth, the third-born. Megan said she was not politically significant, and moved on. Ethan didn't think much about any of it. He had a coolant line on Deck 4 that was leaking, and that felt a lot more urgent than alien royalty. He was elbow-deep in that coolant line when the ship docked. The shudder of the docking clamps ran through the floor, and then the intercoms announced that the Aelori escort had arrived, and all designated personnel should report to the greeting hall immediately. Ethan was not designated personnel, but the coolant leak had spread to a junction box near the upper deck, and he had to chase it. He came up through a maintenance hatch, toolbox in hand, shirt stained with blue coolant fluid, and walked straight into the most important diplomatic moment in human history. The greeting hall was full. The human delegation stood on one side in their best uniforms, straight-backed and nervous. On the other side, the Aelori entered like something out of a dream. They were impossibly tall, impossibly graceful, their silver skin catching the light like polished metal. Their robes flowed behind them, as if moved by a wind that wasn't there. Their faces were sharp and cold and perfect, like statues that had learned to walk. Ethan stood in the corner, holding his toolbox, looking like he had just crawled out of a dumpster. Megan spotted him and gave him a look that could have melted steel. He mouthed the word "sorry" and tried to make himself invisible. The High Sovereign entered last. Drathos was enormous, nearly 8 feet tall, with deep silver skin and markings that glowed faintly gold. His eyes were pale and empty, like a frozen lake. He looked at the human delegation the way a person might look at an insect that had landed on their dining table. Not angry, just mildly annoyed. Behind him came Prince Kalen, who was nearly as tall as his father, and wore an expression of open contempt. He didn't even try to hide it. His eyes moved over the humans like they weren't worth the effort of individual attention. And behind Kalen, almost hidden by a wall of attendants and guards, was someone else. She was shorter than the others, still taller than any human in the room, but small by Aelori standards. Her silver skin was pale, almost white, and her markings were so faint they were barely visible. She wore a simple robe, not the elaborate gowns of the other royals. Her dark hair was pulled back tightly, and she kept her eyes fixed on the floor, as if she were trying to disappear into it. Ethan noticed her, because she was the only person in the room who looked as uncomfortable as he felt. "That's Princess Valeth," Megan whispered, appearing beside him. "Third-born. She's considered plain by their standards. Her markings are too faint, her build is too small. The court mostly ignores her." Ethan looked at the princess again. He didn't see what was supposedly wrong with her. She looked fine to him. Different from the others, sure, but not in a bad way. If anything, she seemed more real than the rest of them. Less like a statue, and more like an actual person. The formal greeting was stiff and cold. Drathos spoke to Captain Bell in a voice that sounded like stones grinding together. He welcomed humanity to Nytheris in words that were technically polite, but carried no warmth at all. Kalen stood behind his father and smiled like a knife. Then came dinner. The dining hall was enormous, with ceilings so high they disappeared into shadow. The tables were made of something that looked like black glass, and the food was served on plates that floated gently above the surface. Ethan had no idea what any of it was, but Megan told him to eat whatever was put in front of him and not to make a face. Ethan was placed at the far end of a long table, well away from the important people. He didn't mind. He preferred it. But when he sat down, he realized that the seat next to him was not empty. Valeth was there, tucked into the corner like an afterthought. She had been placed as far from the main table as possible, far from her father, far from her brother, far from anyone who mattered. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes down, and she hadn't touched her food. Ethan sat beside her in his stained shirt, with coolant still drying on his forearms, and did the only thing that felt natural. "Hey," he said, "I'm Ethan. Nice to meet you." She looked up. Her eyes were wide and silver, like twin moons, and they were filled with something that Ethan didn't expect. Surprise. Not the polite kind, the deep kind. The kind that comes from hearing something you never thought anyone would say to you. She opened her mouth, closed it, and then looked away. Her fingers tightened in her lap. She didn't say a word for the rest of the dinner. But she didn't move away from him, either. And once, just once, when Ethan made a quiet comment about how the floating plates were showing off, the corner of her mouth moved. Just barely. Just for a second. Like a smile that had been locked away for a very long time and was testing the door. The negotiations did not go well. Captain Nora Bell sat across from High Sovereign Drathos for 3 days straight, presenting humanity's case for a trade agreement, a mutual defense clause, and access to shared star charts. Drathos listened to all of it with the patience of someone watching rain fall on a window. He didn't argue. He didn't refuse. He simply let silence do the work, and silence in the Aelori court was louder than any word. On the second day, Prince Kalen attended the session. He sat beside his father with one leg crossed over the other, and spoke without being asked. "Your species has been in space for what, 200 years?" he said. "We mapped this galaxy before your ancestors learned to farm. And now you wish to sit at our table as equals?" He smiled. It was a thin, sharp thing. How charming. Captain Bell didn't flinch. She responded with calm, measured words about mutual benefit and long-term cooperation. Danny Shaw sat in the observation gallery with his fists clenched. Megan Price wrote notes with a pen that was pressing so hard it nearly tore through the paper. Ethan wasn't in the sessions. He had no reason to be. He spent his days doing what he always did, fixing things, checking systems, making sure the ship was ready to leave at a moment's notice. Captain Bell had told the crew to stay sharp, and Ethan took that to mean the engines should be warm. But the Aelori Palace was vast, and his work sometimes took him through corridors that connected to the guest quarters and the gardens beyond. The palace was built from something that looked like white stone, but felt warm to the touch, and every hallway was lined with windows that let in the pale blue light of the Aelori sun. It was quiet, it was beautiful, and it was the loneliest place Ethan had ever been. On the second evening, he found the garden. It was an enormous glass dome filled with alien plants, tall silver trees with leaves that chimed softly in the air, flowers that opened and closed like breathing, pools of water so clear they looked like holes in the ground. The light inside was soft and blue-green, and the air smelled like rain and something sweet he couldn't name. Valith was sitting on a stone bench near one of the pools, alone. She had a small device in her hands, some kind of tablet, and she was reading something on it with such focus that she didn't hear him coming. He stepped on a twig. It snapped. She jumped to her feet so fast that the tablet slipped from her hands and clattered to the ground. Her eyes were wide, her silver skin flushing a faint violet. What Megan had told him was the Aelori version of blushing. "Sorry," Ethan said, holding up both hands. "Didn't mean to scare you." She stared at him for a long moment, her body tense like a bird about to fly. Then she recognized him, the human from dinner, the one with the stained shirt, and some of the tension left her shoulders. "You are Ethan," she said. Her voice was quiet, barely more than a whisper, and she spoke his name carefully, like she was handling something fragile. "That's me," he said, "and you're Valith, right?" She nodded, then quickly bent down to pick up her tablet, holding it against her chest like a shield. "What were you reading?" he asked. She hesitated. Then slowly, she turned the tablet around. On the screen was an image of an ocean, a deep blue, rolling ocean under a yellow sun. Earth's ocean. "I study ecosystems," she said quietly. "Other worlds, their water, their soil, their life. Your planet has so much water. Only the pools we build ourselves." She looked at the tablet and then at him. "Is it true that your oceans are so large you cannot see the other side?" "Yeah," Ethan said, sitting on the bench across from her. "Some of them you could fly over for hours and see nothing but water." Her eyes widened. "That must be terrifying." "It's a little terrifying," he admitted, "but mostly it's just beautiful." She looked at him as if he had said something strange, then looked away. They talked for almost an hour that first evening. It was not easy. Valith spoke in short, careful sentences, and she apologized constantly for talking too much, for asking too many questions, for being boring. Each time, Ethan told her she wasn't, and each time she looked at him like she didn't quite believe it, but wanted to. She told him that she had never left Nytheris. Her siblings had traveled to a dozen worlds, but she had always been left behind. There was no official reason. She just wasn't invited. She told him that her markings, the faint, barely visible patterns on her skin, were considered a sign of weak bloodline. In the Aelori court, appearance was destiny. Strong markings meant strong character. Faint markings meant you were not worth noticing. "My brother Kalen's markings glow," she said softly. "People can see them from across a room. Mine, you have to be very close to see them at all." Ethan looked at her arms. In the blue-green light of the garden, he could just barely make out the patterns. Thin, delicate lines that swirled across her skin like frost on a window. They were subtle, yes, but they were there. "I think they look nice," he said. She blinked. Her mouth opened slightly, then closed. She said nothing, but her fingers tightened around the tablet. They met again the next evening, and the evening after that. Each time, Valith was a little less tense, a little more willing to speak. She asked him about Earth's animals, about snow, about thunderstorms. She was fascinated by the idea of weather that was not controlled. On Nytheris, the climate was regulated by machines. The idea that rain could just happen, without anyone deciding it should, seemed to fill her with wonder. Ethan, in turn, asked about her world. She showed him star charts she had drawn herself, maps of ecosystems on distant moons, notes on species that no one else in her family cared about. She was smart, really smart, and when she talked about her work, the shyness faded just enough to show the person underneath. Someone curious, someone who wanted to understand things. Someone who had been told so many times that she was small that she had started to believe it. On the third evening, the garden was darker than usual. Some of the overhead lights had dimmed to simulate the Aloy night cycle, and the silver trees cast long shadows across the stone paths. Valith was sitting in her usual spot. When Ethan arrived, she looked up and almost smiled. Almost. They talked for a while about nothing important. Then, during a pause, Valith set her tablet down and said, very quietly, "I should not keep taking your time. You have more important things to do than talk to someone like me." "Someone like you?" Ethan said. "Unremarkable," she said, and the word came out like something she had swallowed 1,000 times before. Practiced. Automatic. Like breathing. Ethan looked at her pale silver skin glowing faintly in the dim light, at the delicate markings on her arms that no one had ever bothered to look at closely, at her dark eyes that held more depth than anyone in that cold, perfect court had ever cared to notice. And he said, simply and honestly, without thinking about diplomacy or politics or the 10,000 rules Megan had drilled into his head, "I think you're beautiful." The effect was immediate. Valith's skin flushed deep violet, darker than he had ever seen it. Her hands, resting on the bench, began to tremble. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. Her eyes went so wide that Ethan could see the garden's light reflected in them like two small moons. Then her knees buckled. She tilted sideways, and Ethan moved without thinking. He caught her arm and steadied her, one hand on her shoulder, keeping her upright. "Whoa, hey, are you okay?" he said. She was breathing fast, her chest rising and falling, her silver skin shifting through shades of violet and pale blue. She couldn't look at him. She couldn't look at anything. She stared at the ground, and when she finally spoke, her voice was so small it almost wasn't there. "No one," she whispered. "No one has ever, in my entire life, no one has ever said that to me." Ethan felt something crack inside his chest. Not break, crack, like a door opening to a room he hadn't known was there. He didn't let go of her arm, and she didn't pull away. They stayed like that for a long time, in the quiet of the garden, under the silver trees, while the artificial stars of Nytheris turned slowly overhead. Neither of them noticed the Aloy guard, standing in the shadows at the garden's edge, watching. And neither of them saw him turn and walk quickly toward the royal wing of the palace, where Prince Kalon was waiting. The summons came at dawn. Captain Nora Bell was pulled from her quarters by 2 Aloy guards, who said nothing except that her presence was required in the Sovereign's hall. She dressed quickly, her face calm, her mind already running through every possible scenario. By the time she reached the hall, she had prepared for 12 of them. She had not prepared for what actually happened. Prince Kalon stood in the center of the hall, with his hands clasped behind his back, and a look on his face that was somewhere between outrage and satisfaction. Beside him stood the guard from the garden. Behind them, seated on the raised platform at the far end, was High Sovereign Drathos, watching everything with pale, unreadable eyes. "Your engineer," Kalen said, the word dripping with disgust, laid hands on a member of the Elori royal family. Belle didn't react. "Which engineer?" she asked. "He was seen in the palace gardens, making physical contact with Princess Valith, without consent, without authorization, and without any regard for the laws of this court." Belle's jaw tightened, but her voice stayed level. "I'll need to speak with my crew member before I respond to any accusation." "This is not a request for discussion," Kalon said. "This is a formal charge. Under Elori law, unauthorized contact with a royal is a grave offense. I am requesting that the human delegation be expelled from Nytheris immediately, and that all negotiations be terminated." The words hit the room like stones dropped into water. The Elori nobles lining the walls shifted slightly, the closest thing to a gasp their culture allowed. Megan Price, standing behind Belle, went pale. Drathos raised one hand, and the room went still. "We will convene a tribunal," he said. His voice was deep and slow, like the grinding of tectonic plates. "Then I will decide." Belle nodded. It was the best she was going to get. She found Ethan in his quarters, sitting on the edge of his bunk with his elbows on his knees. Danny Shaw was leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, looking like he wanted to punch something. "Tell me exactly what happened," Belle said. Ethan told her. All of it. The garden, the conversations, the moment he caught Valith's arm when she nearly fainted. He didn't leave anything out, and he didn't try to make it sound better than it was. Belle listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. "You told an alien princess she was beautiful," she said finally. "Yes, ma'am. And then you touched her. I caught her. She was falling." Belle closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. When she opened them, she said, "Megan, what does Elori law say about this?" Megan, who had been scrolling through her notes with trembling hands, looked up. "The law is clear about unauthorized physical contact with royals. But there's a clause. The accused has the right to speak in their own defense before the tribunal. If the tribunal finds the contact was not hostile in nature, the charge can be reduced or dismissed. And if they find it was hostile?" Megan hesitated. "Expulsion, possibly a permanent ban on human presence in Elori space." The weight of that settled over the room like a blanket made of lead. Danny swore under his breath. Ethan stared at the floor. "I need to talk to her," Ethan said. Belle looked at him sharply. "That is the last thing you need to do right now. Captain, she's the one this happened to. She should get a say in this." Belle held his gaze for a long moment. "Can it be arranged?" Quietly. It took Megan 2 hours, 3 favors, and a conversation with a sympathetic Elori attendant, but she managed it. Ethan was brought to a small room near the garden, and Valith was already there, standing with her back to the door, her arms wrapped around herself, as if she were trying to hold herself together. When she heard him come in, she turned. Her eyes were red-rimmed, or whatever the Elori version of that was. Her skin was pale, almost white, her markings completely invisible. "I am sorry," she said immediately. "This is my fault. If I had not been in the garden, if I had not spoken to you, none of this would have." "Stop," Ethan said gently. "This isn't your fault. My brother is using this to destroy the negotiations. He wants you gone. He has always wanted you gone. I know. If you're expelled, if your people lose this chance because of me." She pressed her hands together to stop them from shaking. Ethan took a step closer. He didn't touch her. He just stood near enough that she could hear him clearly. "Valith, what do you want?" She looked up at him, confused. "What? What do you want? Not what your brother wants, not what the court wants. You, what do you want?" She stared at him as if the question had never been asked before, as if it were a word in a language she didn't speak. Her lips trembled. Her eyes filled with something bright and heavy. "I don't want you to leave," she whispered. Ethan nodded. "Then I won't make it easy for them." The tribunal was held that afternoon. The sovereign's hall was full. Every noble, every advisor, every member of the court had come to watch the humans be judged. Kalen stood at the center, like a performer on a stage. He presented his case with precise, cutting words. The human entered a restricted area of the palace without permission. He made contact with a member of the royal bloodline. This is not a misunderstanding. It is a violation. These beings have been in our space for less than a week, and already they have shown that they cannot respect our most basic laws. He paused, letting the silence do its work. If they cannot respect a princess, he said, how can we trust them with anything more? Several nobles nodded. Drathos watched from his throne, his expression as empty as a winter sky. Bell requested permission for Ethan to speak. Drathos granted it with a slight motion of his hand. Ethan stood up. He was still in his work clothes. Nobody had thought to give him anything formal. He looked around the room at the tall, silver faces staring down at him, and he did not try to be impressive. He just spoke. I'm an engineer, he said. I fix things. I'm not a diplomat, and I'm not very good at speeches, so I'm just going to tell you what happened. He told them about the garden, about the conversations, about a woman who sat alone every evening reading about oceans she had never seen, about a woman who apologized for existing, about a woman who called herself unremarkable because the people around her had said it so many times that she had stopped questioning it. I told her she was beautiful, he said, and she almost collapsed, not because I scared her, not because I hurt her, but because she had never heard it before, not once in her entire life. The room was very quiet, and when she started to fall, I caught her arm. That's what I'm on trial for, catching someone who was falling. He looked at Kalen. Where I come from, that's not a crime. That's just what you do. Kalen's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing. Ethan turned back to Drathos. You've spent her whole life telling her she's not enough. I spent 5 seconds telling her she is. And somehow, I'm the problem. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Ethan had ever heard. It pressed against the walls. It filled the spaces between the tall silver columns, and the floating lights, and the cold, perfect faces that stared down at him from every direction. Danny Shaw, sitting in the gallery with his arms crossed, leaned over to Megan and whispered, "That's the most human thing I've ever heard." Megan said nothing. Her eyes were wet. Drathos stared at Ethan for a long, long moment. Then he looked at Kalen. Then, slowly, his gaze moved across the hall until it found Valith, standing in the shadows near the far wall, her hands pressed together, her body trembling, her eyes locked on the human who had just stood before an empire and told the truth. The High Sovereign raised his hand. "The tribunal is suspended," he said. "No verdict will be rendered today." Kalen's composure cracked for the first time. "Father, the tribunal is suspended," Drathos repeated, and the hall fell silent again. Ethan sat down. His hands were shaking. Across the room, Valith was still looking at him. And for the first time since he had met her, she was not looking away. Something changed after the tribunal. It was not loud. It was not dramatic. The Aelori did not do loud or dramatic. But in the days that followed, something shifted inside the palace, like a stone settling into a new position, small, quiet, and impossible to undo. Valith started showing up. It began with the morning briefings. These were low-level court sessions where minor nobles presented reports on trade, agriculture, and colonial affairs. They were boring, routine, and beneath the attention of anyone important. Valith had never attended them before, but on the morning after the tribunal, she walked in, found a seat near the back, and sat down. Nobody said anything. A few nobles glanced at her and looked away. But she was there, and she stayed for the entire session, and when it was over, she walked out with her chin just slightly higher than it had been the day before. The next day, she came again. This time, she asked a question, a quiet one, about water reclamation on a colony world in the outer systems. The noble presenting the report looked startled, as if a piece of furniture had suddenly spoken. He answered her, though, and she listened carefully and nodded. On the third day, she asked 2 questions. On the fourth, she stayed after the session to speak with one of the agricultural advisors about soil composition on a moon she had been studying. The advisor, an older Aelori woman with deep markings and tired eyes, looked at Valeth with an expression that might have been surprise, or might have been something warmer. Megan Price noticed the change. She reported it to Captain Bell, who raised an eyebrow and said nothing. Ethan noticed it too, though he heard about it secondhand. Since the tribunal, he had been keeping his distance from Valeth. Not because he wanted to, but because Bell had made it very clear that another incident would end everything. "You did a brave thing," she told him. "Now do a smart thing and stay out of sight." So he stayed below decks, working on the ship's systems, running diagnostics, replacing a faulty relay in the navigation array. Danny kept him company, bringing food from the palace kitchens, strange, colorless Aelori dishes that tasted better than they looked. "She's changing, you know," Danny said one evening, sitting on a supply crate while Ethan worked under a console. "Who?" "Don't play dumb. The princess. Megan says she's been going to court sessions, asking questions, speaking up. People are noticing." Ethan didn't respond, but something warm settled in his chest. "You broke something loose in her," Danny continued. "Something that was stuck." "I didn't do anything," Ethan said from under the console. "I just told her the truth." "Yeah? Well, turns out the truth was a pretty big deal." Meanwhile, Kaylin was watching. The prince had expected the tribunal to end the human problem once and for all. Instead, it had been suspended without a verdict, which in Aori custom meant the matter was unresolved, a wound left open. Worse, his father had not supported him publicly. The court was whispering, and not all of the whispers were in his favor. And now Valeth, quiet, invisible, forgettable Valeth, was making herself seen. Every question she asked, every session she attended, was a small crack in the wall Kaylin had built around the succession. If she gained influence, if people started taking her seriously, his position as heir became less certain. He needed to end this. Not just the human problem, the Valeth problem. On the 6th day of the summit, Kaylin made his move. He went to his father with a data file. The file contained scan logs showing that the Starward Venture had been conducting unauthorized sensor sweeps of Aelori military installations in orbit around Nytheris. The scans were detailed, precise, and damning. They were also completely fabricated. Kaylin had spent 3 days working with a loyalist in the palace's technical division to create the false data. The scans appeared to originate from the Venture's systems, and the timestamps aligned with the ship's orbital movements since arrival. It was clean, professional work. "Espionage," Kaylin said, placing the file on his father's desk. "They came here pretending to negotiate, and all the while they were mapping our defenses." Drathos studied the file for a long time. His expression didn't change. It never did. But he called for Captain Bell. The accusation hit the human delegation like a wall. Bell examined the data and immediately knew it was fake. The Venture's sensor array couldn't perform the kind of scans described in the file. It was built for navigation and engineering, not military surveillance. But proving that to the Aelori court was another matter entirely. "Their technical systems are different from ours," Megan said, pacing the briefing room. "We can show them our sensor specs, but they might not believe us. They don't trust our technology. They barely trust us." "Can we access our own logs to prove the scans didn't happen?" Bell asked. "We can, but Kaylin could argue we altered them after the fact. It's his word against ours. And in this court, his word carries the weight of royal blood." Danny slammed his hand on the table. So what, we just sit here and get framed? Belle looked at her crew. They were tired, frustrated, and scared, though none of them would admit the last part. She had brought them here to make history, and now history was about to be made in the wrong direction. We have 24 hours before Drathos convenes the court, she said. Use them. Ethan worked through the night, pulling every log, every data packet, every system record from the Venture's computers. Danny helped, running cross-references and double-checking timestamps. Megan coordinated with the ship's communications officer to build a complete timeline of every signal the Venture had sent or received since arriving at Nytheris. By morning, they had a strong case, but not a definitive one. The technical differences between human and Alori systems created enough ambiguity for doubt, and doubt was all Kalen needed. Ethan sat in the engine room, staring at a screen full of data he couldn't use, and felt the weight of it pressing down on him. Not just the espionage charge, all of it. The tribunal, the negotiations, the future of humanity's place in the galaxy. All of it resting on the ability to prove something to people who had already decided not to believe them. And then his communicator beeped. It was a short message sent through the palace's internal system from a terminal in the Royal Residential Wing. It had no signature, but it contained two things, a file location and a name. The file location pointed to a subdirectory in the palace's technical archive. The name was that of Kalen's loyalist, the technician who had helped fabricate the scan data. Ethan stared at the message. He didn't know who had sent it, but he had a feeling. He showed it to Belle, who showed it to Megan, who confirmed that the file location was real and accessible through the palace's guest network. Inside was the original, unaltered version of the scan data, completely clean, with no record of any unauthorized sweeps from the Venture. Someone in the palace leaked this to us, Megan said, her voice barely above a whisper. Belle looked at Ethan. Ethan looked at the message again. No signature, no name, but sent from the Royal Residential Wing. He didn't say what he was thinking. He didn't need to. Across the palace, in a small room overlooking the garden where everything had started, Valith sat with her hands in her lap. The terminal in front of her was dark. She had erased the sent message from the system logs, a trick she had learned years ago while studying the palace's network architecture, back when nobody cared what she was doing, because nobody thought she was capable of doing anything important. Her hands were trembling. Her heart was beating so fast she could feel it in her throat. What she had just done was treason by Alori standards, leaking internal palace files to a foreign delegation. If Kalen found out, if her father found out, there would be no suspended tribunal. There would be no mercy. But she thought about Ethan standing in the Sovereign's Hall, alone, telling the truth to an empire that didn't want to hear it. She thought about the way he had looked at her in the garden and said something that nobody else in her entire life had ever bothered to say. And she thought if he could be brave for her, she could be brave for him. But bravery, she was discovering, was not the absence of fear. It was the decision to move forward while every part of you screamed to stay still. And she was screaming inside, but she had already taken the first step, and there was no going back. She stood up, straightened her robe, and walked toward the Sovereign's Hall. The court would convene in 1 hour. Kalen would present his fabricated evidence. And Valith, the quiet one, the faint one, the one nobody noticed, was going to stand up and tear it apart. Her hands were still shaking when she reached the great doors. She pushed them open anyway. The Sovereign's Hall was full. Every seat was taken. Nobles, advisors, military officers, and court officials filled the long rows of polished stone benches that curved around the central floor like the ribs of some great sleeping animal. The floating lights overhead had been set to their brightest, casting everything in cold white light that left no shadows and no place to hide. High Sovereign Drethos sat on his throne at the far end of the hall, raised above everyone else, his pale eyes watching with the same empty patience he always wore. Beside him, standing with his arms behind his back and his chin raised, Prince Kalen waited, with the quiet confidence of someone who had already won. The human delegation sat in a row near the western wall. Captain Nora Bell was still, her hands flat on her knees. Megan Price had a folder of documents in her lap that she had barely slept to prepare. Danny Shaw sat with his arms crossed, staring straight ahead, his jaw tight. Ethan was at the end of the row, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, turning a small bolt between his fingers, the only way he knew how to keep his hands steady. Kalen stepped into the center of the floor and began. He was good at this. His voice filled the hall without effort, smooth and controlled, each word placed with the precision of a blade. He presented the scan data, projected onto a floating display above the central floor, and walked the court through it step by step. Unauthorized sweeps, military targets, detailed orbital scans of defense platforms and fleet positions. The humans came to us wearing the face of diplomacy, he said. But behind that face, they were mapping our weaknesses. They are not partners. They are predators, wearing the skin of allies. The court listened. Several nobles exchanged glances. Drethos was unreadable. Bell requested the right to respond. Drethos granted it. She stood and presented the venture's own logs, the sensor specifications, the system capabilities, the timeline that showed no unauthorized scans. It was thorough, careful, and technically precise. But Kalen had anticipated this. He dismissed the human logs as easily altered, claimed their technology was too primitive to be trusted as evidence, and suggested that the humans had already scrubbed their own systems to hide the truth. Their own records prove nothing, he said. They are asking us to trust the word of a species we met a week ago over the evidence before our eyes. It was working. The court was nodding. The doubt was spreading like ink in water. Belle sat down, her face calm, but Ethan could see the tension in her shoulders. They were losing. And then the great doors at the back of the hall opened. Valith walked in alone. No attendants, no guards, no one beside her. She wore a simple white robe, no jewelry, no adornment, and her pale silver skin seemed almost transparent under the harsh lights. Her markings were invisible. She looked small. She looked fragile. She looked like a breath of wind could knock her down. But she was walking. Every eye in the hall turned to her. Kalen's expression flickered, just for a moment, just a crack, before settling back into its mask of control. Drethos's gaze sharpened. Valith reached the center of the floor. She stopped. She looked up at her father. "I request the right to address the court," she said. Her voice was quiet. It trembled slightly, but it carried. Drethos studied his daughter for a long moment. Then he inclined his head. "You may speak." Kalen took a half-step forward. "Father, this is hardly the time for—" "She has been granted the right to speak," Drethos said, and the hall went still. She took a breath. Her hands were clasped in front of her, and Ethan could see from across the room that they were shaking, but her eyes were steady. "The evidence my brother has presented is fabricated," she said. The hall erupted in murmurs. Kalen's face went rigid. "3 days ago," Valith continued, "my brother worked with a technician in the palace's Central Systems Division to create false scan data and embed it in the orbital monitoring archives. The original unaltered data contains no record of unauthorized scans from the human vessel. I know this because I accessed the archive myself and found both versions, the real one and the one my brother created." She paused. The murmurs had stopped. The silence was total. "I also know the name of the technician who assisted him. I am prepared to provide it to the court so that the matter can be investigated. Kalen moved toward her, his composure finally shattering. You would accuse your own brother? You would side with animals over your own blood? Valeth flinched. The word animals cut through the air, and for a moment Ethan saw the old Valeth, the one who would have looked at the floor and said nothing, the one who would have apologized and walked away. But she didn't. She looked at Kalen, and when she spoke, her voice was stronger than it had been a moment before. Not loud, not aggressive, just clear. I spent my entire life being told I was nothing, she said. By you, by the court, by everyone in this hall. I believed it. I believed it so deeply that I stopped expecting anyone to see me at all. She paused. And then a stranger, someone from a species you call lesser, sat next to me at a dinner table and said hello. He talked to me like I was a person. He listened to me like what I said mattered. And when I told him I was unremarkable, he looked at me and told me I was beautiful. Her voice cracked on the last word and her eyes glistened, but she held herself together. That is not weakness. That is not a crime. That is something this court has forgotten how to do. And if one human, in 5 seconds, can show more kindness than this entire empire has shown me in my entire life, then maybe we are the ones who are lesser. The hall was silent in a way that felt physical. It pressed against the walls and ceiling like something alive. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Kalen opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. His hands were clenched at his sides, and for the first time, the sharp, cruel confidence that had always defined him was gone. In its place was something raw, something close to fear. Drethos rose from his throne. He stepped down from the platform slowly, each footstep echoing in the silence. He walked past Kalen without looking at him. He walked past the nobles and the advisors and the officers. He walked to the center of the floor, where his daughter stood alone, trembling, holding herself upright through nothing but will. He stopped in front of her. He was nearly 3 feet taller. He looked down at her, and for the first time, he truly looked. Nobody in the hall could read his expression. It was still controlled, still measured, but something behind his eyes had shifted. Like a door that had been sealed for decades, was being pried open from the inside. The accusation against the human delegation will be investigated, he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall. If Prince Kalen's evidence is found to be fabricated, he will face the full consequences of Aelori law. Father, you cannot. Furthermore, Drethos continued, as if his son had not spoken, the tribunal regarding the engineer Ethan Cole is formally dismissed. No charges will stand. He looked at Valeth again. He did not touch her. The Aelori did not do such things in public, but he held her gaze for a long time, and then he said, quietly enough that only those closest could hear, "You should have spoken sooner." Then he turned and walked back to his throne. The investigation was swift. The technician broke within hours and confirmed everything. The fabricated data was exposed, the original logs were verified, and Kalen was stripped of his position in the line of succession. He was removed from the court and sent to a remote colonial outpost. He left Neitherus without a word, but the look he gave his sister as he passed her in the corridor was one she would remember for the rest of her life. That evening, Captain Bell sat down with Drethos for the first genuine negotiation of the summit. He still did not smile, he still did not apologize, but he called humanity unexpected, and from an Aelori sovereign, that was practically a declaration of love. The talks lasted 3 more days. They covered trade, star charts, mutual defense, and cultural exchange. They were not easy, but they were real. On the last night before the starward venture departed, Ethan found Valeth on a balcony overlooking the city. The Aelori skyline stretched out below them, white towers and silver bridges under a sky full of stars that were not his. She was standing with her hands on the railing, and the wind was moving through her hair, and her faint markings, those thin, delicate lines that nobody else had ever bothered to notice, were glowing softly in the starlight, so faintly that you had to be standing very close to see them at all. Ethan stood beside her. He didn't say anything for a while. He just looked at the sky. "Why did you say it?" she asked finally. "That night in the garden, why did you say what you said?" He thought about it. He thought about all the big, important answers he could give, about diplomacy and bravery and standing up for what's right. But none of them were true. The truth was much simpler. "Because it was true," he said, "and somebody needed to say it." Her eyes were full of things she didn't have the words for yet, in any language. She blinked, and something bright slipped down her cheek. "Among my people," she said softly, "when someone changes your life, you owe them a debt that can never be repaid." Ethan smiled. "Among my people, we just call that being friends." She stared at him, her skin flushed violet, her knees wobbled. "Oh no," Ethan said, reaching for her arm. "Not again." She caught herself this time, grabbing the railing with one hand and his arm with the other. She steadied herself, breathing hard, and then, for the first time since he had known her, she laughed. It was small and shaky and surprised, like she hadn't expected the sound to come out of her. But it was real. Danny Shaw, leaning in a doorway 20 feet behind them, with a cup of something warm in his hand, sighed, and said to nobody in particular, "Somebody get that girl a chair." The starward venture departed the next morning. The crew stood at the viewports as Nytheris shrank behind them, a pale blue marble growing smaller against the black. Captain Bell was already drafting her report to Earth Command. Megan was organizing her notes. Danny was humming in the pilot's seat. Ethan was in the engine room, back where he belonged, elbow deep in the coolant system that had started this whole thing. He had grease on his hands, and a wrench between his teeth, and a feeling in his chest that he couldn't quite name. 3 months later, the galactic news networks carried a small item that most species ignored. The Elori Dominion, for the first time in its 10,000-year history, had appointed a cultural ambassador to a newly contacted species. The position had been created specifically for this purpose, and the ambassador herself had proposed it. Her name was Valith Sarai. She was already packing.